Welcome back to OpenLine. We have with us Mayor David Briley. We have also with us Diane Lance with the Office of Family Safety, talking about domestic violence. In the first segment, we talked a little bit about the budget, talked a little bit about this Office of Family Safety and domestic violence. And as we were on break, you were talking a little bit more about something you want to do with the budget to try and capture some more money that is currently coming from tourism, but kind of goes back to the convention center. Is that right?
Right. So back when the convention center was built, there was something called the Tourist Development Zone, where some of the state and local sales taxes collected there go to pay towards the cost of the convention center. And just because of the incredible growth that's taken place and the number of tourists down there, they're generating a little bit more money than they need to cover the cost of paying for the convention center. But at the same time, we've got some additional costs associated with all the tourists down there. And so we're in conversations with the Convention Center Authority about a way to balance out those two things, so that we collect a lot of trash downtown. I think it's 11 times a day we send somebody out with a trash truck to pick up trash or glass or cardboard, and so there's some additional costs associated with that, and we're in conversations about shifting some of those revenues so that there's more flexibility on our side to cover the costs associated with it and give us a little bit more leeway when it comes to paying for the cost of living adjustments and just the cost of doing government generally.
In the last budget, it was worked out that some of that money came to pay for overtime for police and maybe fire, right?
That's true. We got a little bit of a transfer last year, and we're just trying to make it a rational way and sort of look at it objectively so that the costs associated with one are being paid for in an appropriate way. So it's an interesting conversation to have, and we're trying to make it rational is the goal there. And we have probably 20 things we're trying to do in this budget cycle so that we can get to a point of a cost of living adjustment in May, presenting it. We've probably marked 2 or 3 off our list and working on 5 or 6, and maybe the rest are beyond our control, but we're working on it. We're working on it.
When that was set up, it was obviously they wanted the convention center to succeed.
That's right.
And it's been successful.
It has.
There are tons of people downtown. And so that then feeds into that perception that I said earlier, boy, we're booming, you know, yeah. What's the issue?
Well, I think when they designed the boundaries of the tourist development zone, there was another zone in the state of Tennessee that was close to failing, where they had incurred some debt and the tax collections were not sufficient to pay for the debt. And so they were very cautious about the outline of the zone. And we have been just the opposite of close to failing. I mean, it has been a tremendous success for Nashville. So it's a great opportunity for us to take advantage of that success in this moment.
Let's take a call here. Let's go to Lucy. Hello, Lucy. Lucy, are you there?
Hey, y'all.
Go right ahead.
Well, Mayor Briley, I would like to say that I think you're pretty brave to come on TV like this and have people like me call you up and ask you questions. So my question is basically about the city and the library. I had been told several years back by an IT guy that all public Wi-Fi, these are not these hot spots, but say like public Wi-Fi like in a McDonald's or whatnot, goes through Metro government. And I'm like, well, okay. Well, you know, the Patriot Act came into effect and the United States government gave private businesses access to the data they were collecting. Now we know, we've seen congressional hearings and whatnot before Congress about this data and what they're doing with it, and now we have the Russian investigation. I want to know the data that the Nashville Library collects, with people using the computer terminals there, and if that's the case with the public Wi-Fi, how much money does Metro make off of that? And I'll take your answer off the air. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. All right, she's saying, does Metro sell All right. Do you understand? I'll let you answer that question.
I understand the question.
Okay, go
and
right ahead.
Thanks, Lucy, for calling in. I appreciate it very much. I don't believe we collect any data from individuals using the Metro computers in the library. That would be my assumption about it. I'll certainly follow up and make sure that that is the case. We have limitations just from a free speech and perspective in terms of what we can and can't do. I will say that I think the library and having the access to the internet there is really quite important because not everybody has access to the internet in their home or at the work. So I think it's important for us to continue to provide that. And you know, one of the most important places that we have for that is the downtown library. And so, as you know, we're in the process of trying to make some changes to the park right across the street. So it's an interesting question, but I don't think we're collecting any data or getting any money for that.
And I may ask about that in a moment. You're talking about Church Street Park.
I am.
But let's go back to domestic violence and the issue of guns.
Yes.
How often are guns part of domestic violence? And so when we talk about guns, how does that relate to domestic violence?
Well, what we're most interested in looking at firearms is how that escalates the risk for there to be a homicide in that case. And what the numbers show is that when there is a domestic violence relationship involving intimate partners, that the presence of a gun, a firearm in that home increases the risk that there will be a homicide, a murder, by 200 times. If that victim has been threatened with that firearm that's in the home previously, add on another 20 times the risk. So a firearm in the home is a very large risk indicator, which is one of the main things we want to work with victims of domestic violence about. Planning for their safety, understanding what's going on, that this is about control, not loss of control, and also accurately assessing their risk that they may end up being killed in this relationship.
So what do you recommend if they have a gun in the home and they are in a dangerous relationship? What do you recommend?
The main thing I would recommend is calling the YWCA hotline and speaking with one of the crisis counselors on that hotline, or coming into the Gene Crow Advocacy Center located in the Birch Building Courthouse in the Ben West Wing, or when we open up our new Family Safety Center in about February, coming there, because you want to have some expertise around how to be safe, whether again it be in the home, safety for you and your children, and safety with a plan to leave, because leaving is another one of those very high risk moments. So that needs to be done safely and with the assistance of a crisis counselor. And
Ben, one of the things I would add to what Diane said is that just a few years ago, if a woman had called the police and filed a charge of domestic violence against her spouse or partner, they might have to go into the same courtroom together in a very difficult set of circumstances, and it was just not a good situation for women in particular who were asserting a claim against their spouse or their partner. And so through the Gene Crow Advocacy Center, we have created a space that is safe, where people can begin the claim, where they can find people who will help them advocate and help them define the pathway out of an abusive situation, which we just didn't have. It seems very simple and straightforward, but we were sort of putting people into an abusive situation to resolve an abusive situation. And so that's why I think Nashville is pretty unique in terms of how we're pushing forward in creating spaces. And we've hired 12 advocates here in Nashville to help victims navigate through the process. You know, it's a unique circumstance where you're, by definition, sort of required to go back into the same space where the violence occurred, unless we can help people find a way out of it. And that's why what Diane and her department's doing is so important, and sort of changing the trajectory of a lot of lives here in Nashville.
Let's go back to the phones. Let's go to Brooke. Hello, Brooke. Hello, Brooke.
Hi.
Hi, go right ahead.
Hi, hi, Mayor Briley. I am calling to ask you this question because I think it is quite important for all government officials to be behind calls like this when it comes to getting it passed. But I'm a 27-year-old lupus patient, and I still work a full-time job, and I have immense physical pain, and I'm not interested in painkillers. Is the legalization of medicinal marijuana something that you would get behind for the Nashville metropolitan area?
Well, we can't adopt that on a local level. There's no, our state's pretty restrictive in terms of those things, but I do support it on the state level. I know Senator Steve Dickerson here in Nashville has had legislation in the last session that he has tried to move forward, and I support him in that endeavor. I think it's an important thing for us to do in Nashville or in the state of Tennessee, so I do support that.
There was a bill to what was it? Remove some of the criminal penalties associated with small amounts of marijuana.
Right. There was an ordinance passed by the council that would have decriminalized the possession of small amounts of marijuana, and I think the state promptly preempted us on that.
It was passed. That's right. It was that's what I thought. It was passed by the council, but then the state said no, you can't do that.
Right, and it was basically to say it was an ordinance that would have given officers the ability to give essentially a civil citation in lieu of arresting you for possession of a small amount of marijuana. And there's some evidence out there, pretty convincing evidence, that arresting somebody for a small amount of marijuana is not particularly productive when it comes to preventing crime, or and so that was the idea behind that the council was pursuing. Let's go to Taylor. Hello, Taylor. Go right ahead.
Good evening, fellas and the lady, and thank you, Mayor, for coming on tonight. It's a pleasure to have you go over these things. A couple of things. In some of these national surveys, it's not always the it city. It discusses crime problems in Nashville and Nashville debt problems. So my question is, you talked about the bond ratings being stable. Well, they could be stable at CCC, but we'd much rather them be in the AAA territory. Right. So you didn't indicate what they were.
That's right.
And it doesn't matter if you say or not, but I was just bringing that point up. Secondly, I rejoiced, along with several councilmen I know, when the finance director was announced several months ago that he was leaving, and then all of a sudden we found out it might be 6 months or so. Hopefully we can get a new finance director that'll be honest with the council members, what goes on the paper, where the money is spent as it's designated to, instead of side projects and to side contractors that he may be in favor of.
All right, well, let's talk about that. I bet he's talking about somebody who's stepping down. You certainly can disagree with what he's saying there, but I think he's probably talking about the Chief Operating Officer, Rich Riebling, who was Finance Director. Yeah,
so Rich was the Finance Director under the Dean administration, and then stayed on under Mayor Barry as the COO of the city. And I'm going to disagree with you about your assessment of Mr. Riebling. I think he has done a fine job as both Finance Director and as COO. He's decided that he'd like to move on to a new career path, and so his last day will be October 16th, which I think is next Tuesday. And so Rich has been worked hard for the city for a long time, done some great things. The convention center is, I think, a pretty good indication of the kind of work he did for the city. It's turned out to be a good investment, and whenever you do hard work like Rich has had to do, you're going to make ruffle some feathers and make some enemies along the way, but the city has certainly benefited from his hard work for more than or close to a decade now. now, I guess would be about the right time frame. Just so you know, Rich and I worked together back in the early 80s. I was an intern in Mayor Richard Fulton's office back then, and Rich was, I think, a law student and doing some part-time work for Mayor Fulton back then. So I've known Rich for a long time, and I think he certainly leaves having done a ton of great stuff for the city of Nashville.
So it certainly made news when it was said he was leaving, retiring, stepping down, and so it's next week, October 16th.
October 16th is his last day.
All right, let's take one more call before we go to break. Reverend Fuzz, are you there?
Yes, sir. I am here. I got a quick question.
Sure, go ahead.
Good evening, Mayor Briley.
Hello, Pastor Fuzz.
Let me do it this way. I've been doing some numbers in my head, and the police department, we got like 1,500 police officers. If each one of them did 2 arrests or cases a week, there would be 100 at the end of the year, times 1,500. It looks like it's like, what, 150,000 arrests that are 1,500 officers each just did 2 arrests per week or stops per week. That would be 100 at the end of the year, and that would come to 150,000 total. So, and we're actually doing something like 50,000 stops and arrests and prosecuting 3,000 felonies. I'm just trying to ask, how do those numbers mesh? And one quick thing too, we've got 3 stadiums here, baseball, football, TSU has a stadium, the colleges have stadiums. Why do you think that we really need to have to build another stadium for soccer? Why can't they use one of the existing Nissan or the Sound Stadium to play soccer? Surely they could get around scheduling dates that it wouldn't conflict, and it would be worth $300 million to schedule that and work that out. Those are my couple of questions. And
you're questioning whether they're You're questioning whether they're overly aggressive, the police, in making some of these stops.
No, I'm asking why. If it's just we got 1,500 police, how is it we can't get a job done when if you do 2 people a week? I have to wait 4 hours for the police now. Lots of people. You call the police in 4 hours. You call 911, you get a recording. And I'm saying we got 1,500 that do just 2 arrests or incidents a week. That's 150,000 people that we have encountered through the system. So how do we have this problem of not enough?
All right, Mayor. What about that?
Well, we've actually been looking pretty closely at the numbers of stops that are taking place here in Nashville, and I'm not familiar with all of the numbers, but I do have one that I remember pretty well. That is, I think in 2017, we had about 110,000 stops that were for non-moving violations. That's a number that we've looked at pretty closely, and that means for license tag expired or the lights over your license tag burned out. And we've looked pretty closely at those, and we're starting to evaluate the effectiveness of those kind of stops, and starting to talk to the department and all of the precinct leaders in terms of whether or not that's an appropriate use of our resources. We know there's a significant social cost associated with all of those stops, but I think the number is that only about 2% of those stops resulted in any contraband or any arrest being made. So I think we need to start focusing more on community policing, maybe using those resources. For example, at Casey in the last year, we've focused more on community policing and seen violent crime go down really radically at Casey in the last year as part of doing that. So part of the focus is going to be data driven as we look at our police and try and move towards the most effective way of utilizing the resources we have. And I think Pastor Fuzz is onto something that we gotta look closely at data, and gotta look closely at how we're using our resources to make sure that they're being used in the most effective way. And I look forward to partnering with Pastor Fuzz as we move forward in that regard.
All right, we're going to take a break, and then you can answer the soccer stadium. So we asked about the soccer stadium, but that's interesting. So you had some concern about the number of stops that involve a no moving violation.
Right. The police had already started to sort of move away from those in between 2012 and 2017. So we're looking closely at that to see if there's a way for us to move even more aggressively away from those stops and not see an uptick in crime.
All right, we're going to take a break. We'll take some more calls after that. Take a break. Be back right after this.